Hi, this is Rachel Grunwald, Director of Programming at JW3, and I'm speaking to you from the beautiful Howard Hall, which unfortunately at the moment is empty. As you know, we had to close our doors on Monday evening, but we are very much open. As you know, JW3 is not a building. It's a beautiful building, but JW3 is a project with a vital mission and vision. And now more than ever, we want to bring stimulation, inspiration and comfort powered by Jewish values, learning and life into your homes. So we're working really hard on digital programming for the coming months. JW3 TV, as you will have seen. Meanwhile, we've uploaded some of the best of our archive content from the last 6.5 years, so please enjoy. This content's free, but as you can imagine, this is a difficult time for us financially, so if you can donate to keep us going, to keep cross-communal space where everybody is welcome in play and healthy for the future, please do so.
As Melissa said, I'm Claire Balderson, I'm a journalist and broadcaster, and I'm going to be talking to Philippe Sands, who by now is a familiar face to you, having watched that film. And Philippe is a QC, a renowned international lawyer specialising in human rights law internationally as well, professor of international law at University College London, also author of several books, and more recently of a play as well, The Song of Good and Evil, A Song of Good and Evil, which is connected to this film and to the research that he did that then led to this film, and will lead to a book that will be published next year. So I suggest we just go straight into it. So thank you very much for coming along this evening.
I didn't have to come very far. I live about a quarter of a mile away.
And thank you for that remarkable film, which I sort of don't really know where to start because there's so much to ask about. One could do an entire session, I think, on the character of, or several sessions on the character of Horst von Wachter, and then again on Nicholas as well, and on your reactions to it all. But just give us, if you would, a sort of summary of how you got to this film, because that's not where you started out at all, is it? It's not what you were starting to research when you first went to Lviv.
I received an invitation exactly 6 years ago, well, in the spring of 2010, to deliver a lecture on the work that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide. I teach it and I do a lot of cases in that field. And the invitation came from a very obscure place, the University of Lviv. At least it was obscure to me. But the reason that I accepted the invitation was that my grandfather was born in Lviv, which was also Lvov, and was also Lemberg, and I wanted to see what it was like. That was the only reason that I went. And it was the start of many return visits. And I began to uncover more and more about the city and the city's connection, remarkable connections, with crimes against humanity and genocide. Remarkably, the two men who created those concepts in law both studied at the very same university that I was asked to lecture at, and the university was unaware of that fact. I then, probably on the second or third visit, came across what you saw it with the visit of Hans Frank in August 1942, which is essentially his arrival to announce and implement the final solution in Lemberg, as it was then called again, and Galicia. And I became very interested in Hans Frank. I was curious to know how it could be that a lawyer who had been to the finest universities could do what he did. It's a matter, I think, for all of us, how these things happen, still an extraordinary mystery in certain sense. And I read myself into Hans Frank, and I came across a book by Nicholas Frank called Der Vater, the Father, published in English as In the Shadow of the Reich, which was a vicious attack. He despises his father, and it's very clear in the book. And I wanted to meet him, so I just wrote to him. I tracked him down, found him through his publisher, and said I'd love to come and talk to you. And I was very open about my own background, which was of, the son and grandson of people who had been through the Holocaust, who had survived the Holocaust. And he invited me, and we spent 3 hours together, and it was slightly tense to begin with, and then it was fine. And then we really got to know each other, and you've seen, you can make your own mind up about him. He takes an extreme view about his father, but he's a remarkable person. And that then caused him one day to say to me, when I told him about the book that by then I was researching, you're interested in Lemberg, you must meet my friend Horst. They're not all like me. And that was, we then went off a few months later to the Schloss that you've seen, and Horst was extraordinarily generous. He has never said there's anything I can't see, anything I can't look at. He's given me total access to everything.
Why do you think that is? I mean, it's obvious why Nicholas might have taken part in this film, because it's almost as if he can't say enough about how awful his father was and everything that he did. But why did Horst take part?
It's a question that I've been asked a lot. They're very different men in terms of their backgrounds. It doesn't come out in the film, which perhaps is an omission that ought to be corrected in some way. Nicholas is a very distinguished journalist. He was the foreign editor of Stern newspaper for 20 years, and so he really knows his way around the substance and all of these issues. Horst is a sort of rougher diamond, so to speak, and I think there'd always been a silence in his family. One is German, the other is Austrian. I think that makes a big difference. And there'd been a silence in the family. No one was allowed to talk about it. And indeed, he's told me that when he tried to talk about things with his own siblings, no one wanted to talk about it. And I think my arrival somehow catalyzed an opportunity to talk about it. I don't think he really knew what he was letting himself in for. But we continue to be in contact. I'm in contact with both of them, although they are not in contact with each other anymore.
You've ruined their friendship.
I think their friendship has taken a difficult turn. The end of the film makes it very clear that Nicholas has taken a particular view about Horst, and it's very difficult for them, I think, to maintain that relationship.
It's almost as if, in the course of the film, Horst wants your approval, if not your forgiveness, to a certain extent. There's a point where he's talking about how he worked for a Jewish artist, and he talks about you're here, you're a Jew. And it's almost as if he wants you to tell him that it's all right.
He's a very complicated person. One of the things that I've come to realize, and the film is made by David Evans, it's not my film, I'm involved in it, but it's really David Evans' film. The construction of the film is by David Evans, the director, and David Charab, the editor, and it's constructed in a particular way. And it was David's intention, his purposeful intention, to be very fair, particularly to both men, to let them have their say, so that audiences could make up their own mind. But one of the interesting things that we've observed, and I think it was intentional from David's perspective, is people leave the audience a little bit, the audience leaves a little bit confused, because the simple story would be, there's the good one and there's the bad one. And we all like the good one because he says the things we want to hear. And we all don't like the bad one because he says things that we really don't like, that I don't like. And yet there is something about Horst that is very endearing. He's an honest person. He is a sort of innocent person in a sort of way. And for me, the reason I understand I don't like some of the views that he has. I disagree fundamentally, as I say in the film. And yet I've come to understand that people who went through that experience, a father who killed 500,000 people, pause and ask yourself, how would you react to have a father who killed 500,000 people? I don't know how I would react to my father. And for me, the critical moment in the film to understanding Horst and my whole relationship with Horst is that scene very early on when he describes his 6th birthday in April 1945. It really touches me every time I see it, because you can see what's happening there. His world is collapsing. He's a little boy. He's had this normal world. He doesn't know right from wrong in that sense as a 6-year-old. His world has collapsed, and I think the whole of his life has been about reconstituting that world. And Hundertwasser, the Jewish artist, the famous Jewish artist from Vienna, was a route to that. He didn't just spend a few months with him. He spent 10 years with Hundertwasser. He was, Hundertwasser was his master. He wanted Hundertwasser to be his master. And as he says in the film, when I came along, he saw me as an opportunity. I'm not sure if it's doing penance or acknowledgement or what, but I would talk with him on an equal relationship. That was important.
It was extraordinary, that moment when he talks about the end of the war and his 6th birthday, and he says normality broke down. And I was sitting there thinking, his normality was something that in historical terms was so abnormal. It was an extraordinary thing to think, and he still lives, in a way, in that memory, doesn't he?
He does, and it's not a lie. Imagine ourselves as a 6-year-old boy. That's all you've had as a 6-year-old boy, and the whole thing has collapsed. And however much it's an abomination, his normality, and it is, from his perspective as a child, one can understand that the loss of your entire world as a little boy is a devastating thing. And what's interesting for me, and it happens to me every time that I see it, right at the end of the film, it was very unexpected for us. I've had literally 4 years of vitriol from Nicholas about his father. And then on the last day of shooting, we go to the Nuremberg courtroom, and then he sort of carries on with his vitriol, and then we go to the cells. And I said to David, something has changed, he's different. There was something different about him, and you see it on camera. Nothing was rehearsed. There were no two takes on anything. Everything was as it happened exactly. And he calls it a moment of pity for his father. It could be seen as a sort of moment of tenderness. It's the only time I've ever heard him do that. And if you juxtapose his reaction there with Horst's reaction as a 6-year-old, and then the intercession of the image of his father, that remarkable photograph of his father as an infant, you get a sense of what connects them is this going back to childhood.
And I know you mentioned to me in the past that one of the reasons why Nicholas is so adamant about talking about the guilt of his father is in order to free his own children from the guilt of their grandfather, that he feels that if he's honest about it now, if he opens up about it, if he confronts it, then the rest of the generations don't have to, that he's carrying the burden of it for them.
He's taken a conscious decision. That's exactly how he articulates it. I know they each have one daughter, Nicholas and Horst, and I've come to know both of them pretty well. I know Nicholas's daughter very well, Francesca. She's a remarkable, grounded person who does not give the impression of having sort of real traumas about her family background. And the way she describes it is the way her father describes it, the way Nicholas describes it. He took a conscious decision that he was going to deal with this, confront what happened, absolutely everything that happened. And it means that he lives a very troubled and anguished life. He's a troubled and anguished person, but he's created a space in which his daughter can have a sort of normal sort of life, and that hasn't happened with Horst's family.
Are there any questions? There are lots of questions. There are microphones, so please do just hold on a second until you get one. There's one here. There's one here. This gentleman here in a sweater, blue sweater, just there.
Wonderful film, thank you so much.
Just hold the microphone a little bit
Sorry,
closer.
yes. I was going to ask you, how important do you think it is that one is German and one is Austrian? I mean, you know, I'm sure we're all aware here the difference is the way that those two countries see their past. Why maybe Austria's changed quite a lot, I think, in the last 20 years, but they came to it much later than the Germans in terms of, you know, they saw themselves as victims rather than perpetrators. I mean, do you think it's extremely important?
I do. Well, I think it's one of the factors that makes a difference, and that they grew up, that they are of different nationalities, and that they grew up in very different environments in relation to how one engaged with these issues. But I don't think it's the most important thing. I think the most important thing is that one did not feel loved by his father and the other did feel loved by his father. And I think that is a bigger thing. But if you put that in the context of Nicholas growing up in a Germany in which even, perhaps when he wasn't a child, but later on there was a beginning of a confrontation with what happened and engagement with what happened. And that didn't happen in Vienna. I went to the Viennale, the Vienna Film Festival, and we had a huge audience and a 2.5-hour Q&A. We won't keep you for 2.5 hours if you want to stay for 2.5 hours. And at one point I was asked, how do you feel being in Vienna? Because my mother, who's here sitting in row 3, was born in Vienna in 1938 in July. And so it's a big issue in our family, obviously. And I thought, what shall I say? Shall I be polite, English type of person, or shall I say what I think? And I thought, no, I'll say what I think. And I said, you know, the truth is, I'm incredibly comfortable now in Germany. I grew up as a child in a household where we did not have German things in the house. And that's just gone by the by. I feel really comfortable when I'm in Berlin, when I'm in Hamburg, a little less perhaps when I'm in Munich, but you get the sense. It's very comfortable for me. I don't feel comfortable in Vienna. And that provoked a commotion in the audience. There were 250 people in the audience. And the older people immediately started attacking me and said, no, you're wrong, it's not like that, it's all changed. We've built monuments, we've built statues, we've done this, we've done that. And the first 4 or 5 people who took the floor were like that. And then, it was interesting what happened, younger people started speaking. And they said, no, Sands is right. We are not allowed to talk about these things. And then some of them started telling their stories about what they just discovered about their own grandparents and their own great uncles. And you really got the sense, it was very bizarre, because there's that moment where in the Purcell room, and Horst says, very knowingly, we could never have this conversation in Vienna. And here we were, having this conversation in Vienna, and it was mayhem in an auditorium like this, because people were really having a go at each other, trying to discuss this issue. I think it is an issue. I don't think for these two it's the dominant issue.
The lady in a stripy yellow and green scarf.
Thank you so much for this evening. A very disturbing film that is going to certainly take me a long time to process. I wanted to ask you, would you agree that Nicholas was enabled to begin processing his father's history because justice was done? His father was actually brought to court and the truth was made open. Whereas, would you agree that Horst was the victim of failure to bring justice? His father was not brought to justice, therefore the justice of the truth being out in the open was not available to him.
I think that's a very astute point. I definitely think that because his father was indicted, and you see I've now found all of the documents of the indictment of mass murder, killing of hundreds of thousands of people, and I've got no question that if he had gone to a trial he would have been convicted and he would have been hanged. No question, there's no doubt, it's 100% certainty. And the fact that that didn't happen creates a space that Horst can occupy, and he can say to me with a straight face, he was innocent, he was never convicted, and I as a barrister have no answer to that. And it has alerted me to the realities and the dangers of a criminal justice system which focuses on just 3 or 4 bad eggs in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, wherever it might be, and just creates a space in which others can disappear, and the legacy, in a sense, does continue. And that has caused me to think how there must be other ways to deal with this, whether it's the South African Truth and Reconciliation way or other ways of dealing with these things. But equally, if you look at it on the other side, imagine Nicholas as a 7-year-old boy living in Bavaria, going to school every day, and his dad's trial is in the newspapers every day, and he's being ribbed by everyone else at school. So as a 7-year-old child, that is a really tough thing to go through. And then your mum takes you to the prison cell that we were in, and you go in, and your dad's sitting in the cell next to Goering is on one side. And I mean, it beggars belief. The reality is, as you've seen, I wasn't aware of those pictures that he painted when he was 15, but by the age of 15, when as he tells us, when all the other boys in the art class at school were allowed to paint flowers and trees and landscapes, the teacher recognized there was something going on and said, you know what, why don't you paint what's in your head? And we see a little bit what's in the head. So they took different directions, and I'm sure the point you make is in some way connected to the different directions that they took.
And is that then connected also to the way that Horst sees everything as the product of the system? He keeps talking about the systems and a sort of collective responsibility, while of course the Nicholas is saying all the time, no, it was my father and he did this and it was individual. So they've come to that because of what happened in the court.
Well, I think for Horst that's a survival mechanism, because I think he's got to the point where he cannot open that door. I've said this before, and maybe there are sort of analysts and psychotherapists here in the audience tonight, but I was concerned about what the consequences of these conversations would be. And so I got assistance from a couple of psychoanalyst friends. And one said to me, you know, Philippe, Horst is like the Schloss in which he lives. The outside walls appear to be very strong, but inside is on the point of collapse. And you have to be incredibly careful how you have these conversations, because really anything could happen. And I said, anything? He said, yes, absolutely anything. And it was always sort of hovering around. I thought, oh, you know, where's this going to go? Because actually, I do like him, and I really don't want this to take that kind of direction. And I think the reality is, Horst gives those answers to those questions about collective responsibility being part of the system, because it's a way of avoiding dealing with the terrible truth, which is that his father was a mass murderer. And there's no escaping that. So it's a survival instinct, and when you understand it as a survival instinct, through someone who's been through a great trauma, you look at it perhaps in a more generous way, which is how I look at it. Even though I don't like his views, I understand him to be someone who's been damaged as a child by the experience that he went through, with help that I've had from people who've helped me understand what has happened.
There was someone over here. Yes, sorry, this gentleman here.
Totally engrossing portrait of Horst. And there was a context that I keep thinking about for the picture that he refers to all the time about his father, because the context of Nazi rule in the Ukraine was quite distinct from what Nazi power was doing elsewhere in the East. They were playing a double game or a triple game, and Ukrainians were responding in a plethora of different ways, with the Nazis, against Stalin, for Stalin, independent of all. There was a civil war going on within Ukraine, and there was guerrilla war going on against all and with all. There was utter chaos in the Ukrainian community. So I can imagine that in all of that, there were enough stories to feed any construction that the son of that father might want to put on it. So I mean, I slightly lacked a sense of that historical context, the complexity that...
I think that's a very fair point, but it's a 90-minute film and there's just a limit to what you can do. I think in a book, which will come out next year, you can do a lot more. But I think that's a fair point. I think it's very important to make the point that those appalling scenes and those appalling individuals, which came as a real shock, I have to say, to me and to David Evans and to Nicholas, to be with those people was really shocking, as shocking an experience as I've ever had. But you must understand that it was as shocking for the Ukrainians who accompanied us. And a couple of them were really in tears after spending a day like that, ashamed that that was happening. And you must understand that that is not the dominant view in Ukraine. There is a minority that holds that view and dresses up in uniforms like that and goes to Maidan Square, but that is not the majority view. And the way you've characterized it is, I think, very accurate. There's a struggle from the time of eternity for Ukraine. Is it East or is it West? And that struggle is going on today. And we're seeing, and we're living through it again today. And what I've learned through this experience is you can't, I'm very resistant to the idea of labeling people as groups, and there's Ukrainians and Russians and Germans. We just know through our own experiences you can't do that, and we have to resist doing that. It was very difficult for us in making the film because we just didn't have time, or David just didn't have time to go into the other part of the Ukraine, and that point resonates. We're going to show it at the Kiev Film Festival in March, and I suspect we're going to get a lot of grief, but we'll be protected by our very good Ukrainian friends who opened the doors to us. The wonderful woman you see there who's interpreting, who's a dear, dear friend of mine, is just horrified, more horrified than I or Nicholas about that. So your point is a very strong one.
We'll hear from the gentleman here and then we'll go into the middle.
I want to thank you, whoever was involved in organizing it. And just an aside, I have experienced personally what you illustrate in the film.
Speak closely.
Closely. What you illustrate in the film, I've actually experienced. An eminent Japanese scientist, we discussed the war, and he said, yes, in 1945, a teacher came to my class and said, everything we taught you yesterday was a load of lies. Now we have to start again. So in Japan, we've had sort of similar experiences. The other thing that happened to me at the scientific conference when I least expected was a scientist came to me and said, I have to talk to you. And I thought we were going to discuss research. And he said, you know, I know you're Jewish and you suffered in the war. I suffered more than you did. And I looked, I thought, what is he going to tell me? He said, my grandfather was the commander of Camp so-and-so, and my mother thought he was a hero. Now, he was older than your characters. He wasn't 6 at the end of the war. He was about 14, 15. And he confessed to me that he is still suffering. So those 2 points you made in the film, I've actually seen in their own way. Actually, if I may hog the conversation.
I'm going to get you to move on because we've got a lot of
Oh,
questions.
I see. I was
So
just
if
going
you
to
don't
ask
mind-
one question,
Yes, do ask a question.
which I'm not going to get an answer to. Is in your portrayal of all this, you've left what I think is a salient problem of the whole story and all other stories of the Holocaust, is the religious component. And that is, there is the confession at the end, and there is the synagogue. But the whole background to the Holocaust is basically a religious one.
I mean, I think there are a lot of competing views as to why what happened happened. The central point that you make is very important. The story here, on its face, is about Jews and Nazis, but actually it's a universal story about fathers and sons. And that was brought home to me with a screening that we had, a private screening very early on at UCL where I teach, where we had people from different countries coming. And I've got a Cambodian PhD student who was very affected by the film, as maybe some of you will be, because he said, Philippe, in Phnom Penh, it is exactly the same today. What happened, want to engage with it, some people are willing to engage with it, and those who want told, go away, don't trouble us with all these stories. A lawyer from the Ministry of Justice in Argentina said exactly the same thing. A young lawyer from Eritrea said exactly the same thing. And so what we have to all try to do is to imagine that there is a replication, whether it be in Japan or in China, of these kinds of situations. Parents who did things that were very, very bad, leaving a legacy of children and grandchildren who are struggling to come to terms with what happened and are torn between two competing desires. On the one hand, the understandable desire to do justice to the facts, and on the other hand, and Horst is not a Holocaust denier. He knows what happened, he doesn't deny anything. He knows what happened, he just wants to find a way to persuade himself that his dad wasn't involved in it. So we understand that, but equally we understand the instinct which is to find the good in one's parent. And that's a very honourable instinct. And that's what causes so much difficulty, I think, is that we all sort of understand what Horst is trying to do. We wish he would find another way to do it, but the heart of what he's trying to do is not a bad thing. That is the way that I look at it.
It's interesting that you talk about wanting to find the good in one's parent, because it's like Nicholas doesn't want to find the good in either parent. He's scathing about his mother, which I hadn't realised before, that he's absolutely scathing about her, and clearly felt unloved by her. He was brought up by the nanny, and she was the person who gave him, what did he say, she gave me my humanity.
Well, there's a whole other film that we could make about the wives, because the wives are incredible, and the wives had a real hold over their two husbands, and I'm sure the husbands had a real hold over their wives. But you get the point that I make. It was extraordinarily complex set of relationships.
The lady in the black and gold stripy cardigan in the middle there. I probably haven't described it accurately.
Thanks very much for that. I actually found this film really difficult to sit through. I was looking at my watch. I found it quite intolerable. The evening that the three of you presented on the evening, I had similar feelings. I'm feeling quite angry. It struck me just now that Horace, I thought, why is he here? And he seemed to take some pleasure from the evening. And everybody was angry towards him. And he kind of sat back, almost grinned, actually. And I wondered if he was getting some pleasure from this. And then it suddenly struck me something a bit kind of masochistic about that moment. That somehow he was almost kind of enjoying it in kind of a perverse way. That suddenly he felt himself becoming victim of that room, where he was at the receiving end of everybody's anger, and how he and his family were being unfairly accused. And I think he kind of relished in that moment, if that makes some sense.
I'm not sure it goes quite like that either. I mean, the Purcell, I think the majority was pretty irritated by him, but he had his supporters in the room. It was quite interesting. And I think that to understand his reaction, you've got to also put it in a broader context. He's the sort of black sheep of the family. He, apart from his wife and his daughter, the rest of the family, his nephews, his nieces, siblings, basically said, we don't want anything more to do with you. Why? Because he has exposed the Wächter name to public scrutiny. They had done a pretty good job of covering up the Wächter name. It's a big family in Austria. And along comes dear Horst, who says, look, actually, I think it's better that there is a debate about all of this, and there's a debate about what my father did. And you know what? At my instigation, he says to his family, I'm going to give all of the family papers to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And he's done it. He's given every single one of his mother's diaries and the father's letters and everything. And they're all going to be digitized and made publicly available. And that makes the rest of his family incandescent. Why? Because it subjects to public scrutiny what did and did not happen. So I understand from your perspective what you're saying, but it doesn't resonate with me because I think he's up to something else. I think he wants to sort of persuade people, but even if he doesn't persuade people, he thinks it's better that these things be discussed publicly. And he's had a lifetime of being told he can't talk about these things. And I think that is incredibly significant that he has done that. And I think the reality is the Nicholas type figure is a minority out there, and Horst is the majority. And so remarkable, because how many other Horsts have you come across? Probably none on camera. We can't think of anyone like Horst who's been willing to subject himself to this, and yet I think he is more likely to be the dominant view. And so I understand your anger, and I understand your frustration and your irritation, but look at it also from the other side. Thankfully, someone of that ilk has now come out, spoken, and exposed the kind of justifications that go on and the kind of beliefs that go on, and I think that's a good thing.
And I think that's why it's so interesting, is that he's so incredibly honest about his dishonesty. And it's quite hard to sort of reconcile that in your head, and I can see why it makes you angry and frustrated, absolutely. Because here is this man who doesn't cover anything up at all. He doesn't hide anything, does he?
Well, he doesn't, but he's sort of deluded. I mean,
he's deluded. He's dishonest, but he's honest about his delusion.
Well, but he is honest about his delusion. There's the moment when I finally show him the indictment of his father. And I love that moment because he's got a very transparent face. They both do, actually. And the camera lingers, and there's a lot of lingering on their faces. And you watch the face, and you can see what's going on. The cogs are turning around. Right, how do I get out of this one? He's buying time. I recognize in the courtroom. They're looking for ways to buy time, to work out what it is they're going to say, to compose themselves, and to come up with a plausible reaction. And guess what? Amazingly, he comes up with a plausible sort of reaction. He says, oh, of course, it's a Soviet document. And, you know, we may not ultimately be persuaded by that, but it's a terrific, it's a terrific process that he's gone through to get to that.
Is there anyone towards the back? We haven't been up into those... No, sorry, then the lady here on the end of the road.
I'd like to ask you something about the process of the film itself. Obviously, there's a lot of film on the cutting room floor. Were you perfectly happy with the way it came out, and particularly in the way that you do seem to be persecuting Horst a lot more than you are Nicholas?
I think, again, that's a very good question to ask. The film is made by David Evans, who's a very close friend of mine. We were at university together. And there was an agreement that we had in going into the process, which was that we would proceed on trust. There's a lot of trust between me and Nick, and me and Horst, but there's a lot of trust also between me and David. And I said to him, it's your film, and you can show me whatever you want, and you can consult with me. and I'll give you my opinion, but ultimately it's your decision what goes in and what goes out. And there are bits of the film that I don't like. I don't like the scene in the Aula. I don't like the scene where I'm confronting him. And the reason I don't like that scene is that it goes against how I'm trained to be as a barrister and as an academic, which is, you know, impartial, unemotional, dispassionate. But being and grandson myself, that I can't keep it all in. So there's a tension between how I come across and what makes a good film. And in fact, one of my favourite reviews is one in one of the big US newspapers, which says what's really interesting about this film is quite obviously Sands has not tried to make himself come across looking good at all times in the film. And that's true. And I like that. It makes for a more honest and for a better film. Originally, I wasn't going to be in the film, and I didn't want to be in the film. Originally, I was going to be off camera, and the film is divided in half. In the first half of the film, when the interviews are being conducted, I'm not in camera, basically. I'm a bit of wandering around, but essentially it's face-to-face interviews. And then in the Purcell room, I adopt a median position. I don't express a view in favour or against Nicholas and Horst. And if you were in the Purcell room, you'd remember I tried to be very even-handed in criticising both of them or throwing more difficult questions to each of them, although the audience was pushing in one direction. And then at the end of the Purcell room, which we thought was going to be the end of the film, Horst says, yes, you might remember, he took the microphone and he said, and you need to know that my dad is venerated in the Ukraine. And after we left the stage, backstage, I said to him, well, let's go to the Ukraine. Let's go and see these guys who venerate your dad. July, when they will have the Waffen-SS Galicia division. So it was his idea to go. You know, being in that place, as you saw, experience for me, and you shed your training, and so I'm not, you know, I'm uncomfortable in some of the scenes the way they come out, but I'm not uncomfortable with the.
Do you feel that anything changed for you in how you view your family's history, what happened, what's happened since, and through the process of making this film? Did it reveal anything to you about yourself and how you view the past?
Well, the film is part of a bigger project and a book project. So I've discovered a lot of things over the last 6 years, and so I'm just more comfortable. I mean, I'm generally someone who prefers to know things, even if they are bad things, than not know things. It has confirmed my sense not to talk about it. Your own children from bad things. So I understand very much the instinct. I understand also the protective instinct of the parent and the grandparent not sharing with their child or grandchild terrible things that have happened that they've been associated with, either as perpetrator or as victim. But I think in the long run, society and families pay a much bigger price. I don't think the secrets go away. I think they re-emerge, and they re-emerge with a vengeance much later on, often generations later on. They're buried away, and they're carrying out their mischievous function. And I've understood, I suppose, that in a way that I had not fully understood, and I still don't fully understand, that for men, children like Nicholas and Horst, who were on the other side of the equation that my family went through, it's not the same trauma, it's not an equivalent trauma, but it's a trauma. And we need to be aware of that, and I think I've become much more aware of that.
You wrote in that FT piece that's what triggered this whole film, about the collective connection between the three of you. Is that what you meant by that? Because when I read that, I thought, how can there be a collective connection between three people, two of whom were on one side in the Holocaust and one of whose family was on the other side? Your experiences, your family's experiences of Nazism was so different, and yet that collective connection is actually the trauma of the whole experience.
You know, it was when the film opened, about 3 weeks ago, we were invited, I don't know if you heard it, we were invited onto the Today programme. Horst wasn't able to come, although we'd done other festivals with him. And so it was just Nicholas and I went onto the Today programme, and you can listen to it. And in fact, it became a pick of the week selection. Some of you may have heard it. And the exchanges between John Humphrys and Nicholas were very, very interesting. And right at the end, John Humphrys, who's a pretty astute journalist, said to me, "How is it for you to be around these men?" And I said, "That's a very interesting question." It was about a week or so after the terrible events in Paris. And I said to John on the radio, on live radio, well, imagine the following scenario. Imagine in 70 years' time, that the son of one of the murderers, the mass murderers in the Bataclan in Paris, comes to know the grandchild of one of the people whose families he has, decimated. Because that's what it is. And Nicholas and I have an excellent relationship. And I think that's why, at the end, I don't think it's frustrating and awful. I think there's a positive side also. I think that it's remarkable that Nicholas and I can have a friendship, and it is genuinely a friendship, that it was just 70 years ago that his father was busy wiping out my grandfather's family, and yet we are now able to have a relationship which has its issues and has its difficulties like any relationship, but nevertheless, it's a trusting and decent relationship. And I think that is a very optimistic thing. And so, I tend to look on the bright side. Even though the world right now, I have to say, it's difficult indeed to look on the bright side.
And Horst called you a pessimist several times in that. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. There's somebody here.
Film and for your commentary on Second Generation.
Put the microphone up close to your mouth.
Thank you very much for the film.
Even closer.
Right up close.
Right up here.
Even closer.
There.
No, even closer.
Hold it like this.
Like this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Fine. Thank you very much for the film and for your commentary. Like a lot of people here, I think I'm the second generation person too, so these things interest me. Was it just for the families that the lives these two men had led? So what I saw was two old men talking about their fathers and without any of their family around them, and it's only in your commentary that you've shaded that in, as it were, and it's been very interesting, and I'm anxious to know more about it, and I wondered why you decided to leave that out, as it were.
I think it's the format of a 90-minute film. And again, it was David's decision, but we actually had many hours of interviews with the wives, with the daughters, and time spent talking about their own lives other than on this. And the filmmaker's job is to tell a story, and David chose to tell a particularly intense story as he told it. I know that in the DVDs that are going out in the United States and here in the UK, the extras will include some of the stuff. Someone mentioned it. There's literally, for 90 minutes, there's probably 140 hours of filming that has gone. Imagine an editor who has to sift through all of that material. There's also, I should say, not just that material, but no one's mentioned it here, but in other Q&As it's been mentioned, the remarkable home videos. Every single home video you see there has never been shown publicly before. It is extraordinarily rare footage, rare colour footage from the Krakow ghetto that has never been seen before, and Nicholas allowed taken. That could be said, but it's the nature of a 90-minute film. The idea, I suppose, was you could make a, Claude Lanzmann type 11.5-hour saga about the two men, and there's enough to cover that, or a Marcel Offel's Memory of Justice. But 90 minutes, there's just a limit. And I think it's right, there's a limit to how much information the human brain can take in and can compute in a 90-minute sitting and segment. But it's a good point.
Is there somebody else? Is this gentleman here in the blue jacket?
Do you have a sense of failure in that you did not get Horst to accept? You've spoken about being a QC and about cross-examining. Do you? That's the question. Do you have a sense of failure?
Here's the irony. I failed miserably. in my efforts, but we have a better film because of that. We wouldn't have a film if I had succeeded, is the reality. I would have preferred to have succeeded, to be honest, coming back to the question earlier, but I sort of admire, you know, it's like when you are in court and you've got an opponent who's a dogged opponent, or you've got someone who you're cross-examining who's an expert or a witness, and they are dogged and they dig their feet in and you can't break them down. It's intensely frustrating, but you always have a sense of admiration that somehow they've withstood an onslaught that can go on for days, or in this case, much more than that. It was one of the things that I learned is that there is, I mean, David, the director, and I had a different interest. Because I didn't go into this to make a film. I went into this because I was fascinated with Nicholas and Horst. And so there'll be moments where David and I have a totally different take on what is about to happen. So for me, one of the worst moments in the film is when, having declined to accept the gun from the delightfully named Wolf Sturm in an SS uniform right towards the end, Horst then decides to get into the car, which is an actual Nazi military vehicle. Front, like any normal person would do. He goes and sits in the back. Point. None of this is being directed. I'm standing next to David, and I'm thinking, oh, please don't get into the car, and please don't get into the back of the car. And later, David said to me, his thought was the opposite. Please get into the car, and if you're going to get into the car, please get into the back of the car. And your question raises that issue that, you know, what I may have wanted, which was to break him, and I failed, was the opposite of what David might have wanted. I mean, David also wanted me to succeed, but he knew that if Horst had collapsed into a great heap at the mass grave, where he's plucking flowers, and he came, I think, very close at that point. Very, very, very close. The conversations we had after that were incredibly difficult and intense. You really could feel. But if he had collapsed then, I think that the film, it just wouldn't have the same resonance.
It would have been quite Spielbergish, but it wouldn't have...
It's definitely not a Hollywood movie.
There's time for one more, if there's anybody else. Here in the blue, right in the middle there. Yeah.
I really found this amazing, but I wanted to ask you, what was your purpose originally to make the film about what?
It didn't start as an exercise in making a film. As I said right at the outset, it started with an invitation to give a lecture, which then led to research on a book. And as a side project, my editor, I write a couple of articles a year for the Financial Times magazine, the colour bit on Saturdays. And my editor said, write an article about Horst, because he's interesting. And what then happened was 6 months later, David Evans, the director, filmmaker, amazing, and it had attracted quite a lot of attention. Why don't we make it into a film? And we then got together with a third person, who is our friend, a dear friend from university. I mean, it's all a sort of North London, you know, it's the usual thing of go and see your mates and sort it out. Amanda Posey, who is a film producer of films like Brooklyn, and these kinds of films, so big serious film producers said, yeah, I'll produce it, it's a great idea, let's make it. And when we started off, we did not know where we were going to end up. And that's why you get the sense of slight repetition, which David likes, and which Nick Fraser at Storyville likes, is that the road that we are taking is unscripted. It began with the face-to-face interviews, then we thought, okay, let's get the personnel room thing together, and we had no idea where that was going to lead to. And so you're taking people on a journey. And we're now making a second film, My Nazi Legacy 2, And then there's the third one coming, My Nazi Legacy 3, so you've got years of this coming ahead. And it's the same process with the second film, and it's a real thrill, actually, not knowing where you're going to end up. It's unexpected. And that, I think, is the magic of the film that David has made, is he takes you on a journey more or less in real time. And the reason certain things persist and keep coming back and recur is that at each time we got to another place, we kept coming back in our conversations to the same kinds of issues, but we were in, each of us in slightly different places. I think my purpose was to be involved in the making of a film that people would come and watch, and that has happened in spades, and we've had wonderful interviews, wonderful reviews, which has been very gratifying. And David wanted to make a film that made people think, and that was not easy. And the best thing that has been said tonight is, which I will report back to David faithfully, is this film in intense discomfort, wanting to leave, finding it really painful, difficult, troubling. And David wanted to make a film that caused people to think about these things, to ask ourselves the question, what would we do if our dads had killed 500,000 people? How would we react? And there's no simple answer to that question. If my dad had killed 500,000 people, I hope that I would take Nicholas's line, but actually there's every chance I wouldn't, probably a greater chance that I wouldn't, and I'd sort of somehow find a way. Who knows, who knows? And that's the complexity of the issue. It's a universal theme, and the questions tonight, which have been wonderful, and I thank you very much for them, and Claire for facilitating them, illustrate to me that there's something in this film that touches a very deep thing about human nature, about our relationships with our parents, our relationships with our children, and how we distinguish between right and wrong, and how we deal with right and wrong, and how legacies continue to be felt over generations.
That sounds to me like a very good point on which to end, which we'll have to do now because I'm afraid we've run out of time here. Philippe, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the film, and thank you for joining us this evening.